Hey there, in this video I will show you my Templar healer setup for Dungeons and Arenas updated for the Greymoor chapter. Templar healer is my main, and I actually use this build almost every day and have done basically all Dungeon and Arena achievements on it. But before we get started with the build, I just want to acknowledge that the Herostone version is now at way over 20,000 views, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me. So I'm having a ton of fun creating videos and interacting with you in the comments, and it's just great seeing the effort I put into guides being appreciated. So thank you for all the amazing support so far. But let's get into the actual build now. This is a off-healer build, meaning it is a hybrid between healer and damage dealer, bringing considerable DPS to a group while still being fully capable to heal and support. This is, in my opinion, the best playstyle if you want to play as a healer in 4-player content, as the damage is only slightly behind a 3 damage dealer group, while still having the benefits of a healer. It is also very strong for pickup groups, since the versatility allows for countering a group's weaknesses and gives a huge carry potential. I would, however, not recommend this build for beginners. In this video, we'll go over the main build, additional set and skill options, the rotation, and how to utilize it in actual combat. Here's an overview of the entire build that I will go through one by one. For the race, I recommend Breton, as the combination of very strong sustain passives and survivability provides you with a lot of value and allows you to focus more on the offensive stats in other aspects of the build. Other good choices are Altmer, Dunmer, Agonian, and Khajiit, but they all come with their downsides that you might need to adjust to. Vampire has always been a good choice for healers in the past due to the increased sustain. However, this has changed now, and I would not recommend it anymore, unless you really want to use one of the active skills, as it otherwise has basically only downsides. For my Magicka health balance, I am usually running 64 attribute points into Magicka with Magicka health food. Food with Magicka regeneration is also a good option if you need more sustain, however you might need to adjust your health pool accordingly. I mostly play in coordinated groups where fights are very short, so sustain barely matters to me. If you are running with weaker groups though, it's very likely that you will need to use rec food. For the Mundus, I decided to use Thief as it gives me the best DPS with my otherwise rather low crit and increases my healing as well. This Mundus choice becomes more important should you run a crit-dependent setup, but I will get into that later. For more difficult content, I run spell power potions, increasing my crit and spell damage. However, Magicka drop pods are, in my opinion, just fine for most dungeons. In terms of gear, I decided to this time show you 2 options, but no matter which one you use, you always want to have at least 5 light armor pieces, and ideally 1 medium and 1 heavy. Gear option number 1 hasn't really changed and is still what I use most of the time, and that is Autorim and False God. Autorim is a super powerful and easy to use support set that I can backbar, allowing me to have that Maelstrom stuff on my front bar. False God, on the other hand, is a very versatile and stat efficient DPS set that takes care of a lot of my sustain. On top of that, it provides a speed buff, which comes in really handy when rushing through dungeons. As I already said, I'm using a Maelstrom Lightning Staff as my front bar weapon. A Lightning Staff is really important to push the off-balance and vulnerability uptimes, similar to a traditional healer, but it also synergizes very well with the large amount of AoE in this build. Having it on the front bar has also become stronger with Greymoor due to the added penetration from the perfected version. The monster set is what I use to adjust for specific content. My primary offensive choice changed from Grothdar to 2 one-piece crit bonuses recently, as it is only marginally weaker than a full set, but a lot more convenient to play. Additionally, I sometimes use Ice Heart if I need to make sure that I can't die. And should I need more group support, I go with Symphony of Blades. Even though it is weaker in 4-player content now, it is still the best support monster set. As the secondary gear option, I have Spellpower Cure and Master Architect. Both sets are double barred, so instead of a monster set, I decided to go with Maelstrom weapons on both bars. Maelstrom Lightning Staff on the front bar, just like the first setup, and a Maelstrom Healing Staff on the back bar, as the removal of the cooldown made it a pretty strong sustain tool. This setup provides additional offensive support over the first one, but gives up sustain and mobility. I personally prefer the first one on Templar, but especially if your group needs more burst damage, the second one can be very powerful. as it allows you to time 3 strong ultimates with a Major Force and Major Slayer in coordinated groups. This setup is also where critical chance is especially important, as the Maelstrom Restoration stuff requires critical healing to work. You can of course also use Ulrim with Master Architect or Spellpower Cure with False God, but the two combinations I've shown you are what plays best in my opinion. In terms of easy to get gear options, you could use the normal versions of all the perfected sets. Especially normal Maelstrom weapons are very easy to obtain now, as they drop in normal. If you can't or don't want to use trial gear, I recommend using Spellpower Cure and Mother's Sorrow with both Maelstrom weapons. Continuing with traits and enchantments. I'm running full Divines with Magicka, however you can also run 1 or 2 health enchantments if you play with Wreck Food. On the jewelry I use 3 times infused spell power. Bloodthirsty does theoretically give more DPS, however I find it a bit hit or miss in actual fights. A lot of the more difficult dungeon fights have chaotic execute phases with high incoming damage, making it harder for a healer to keep up the DPS, so you can actually end up losing DPS with Bloodthirsty. The weapon traits and enchants have not changed from Harrowstorm, however I want to clarify them a bit more this time. Last patch, Infused Berserker on the healing stuff was somehow bugged, either showing or actually achieving far too high uptimes. Having redone all the testing with Greymoor, the uptimes are now where they should be at between 40 to 50%. Nevertheless, the Infused Berserker backbar and Precise Shock frontbar is still giving me the highest DPS and some good support. For the CP, I'll show you a balanced setup, since dungeons feature a large variety of damage types and mechanics, and I don't think that it's necessary to adjust your CP for each dungeon specifically. Starting with the red CP, I run 81 Ironclad, 24 Spell Shield, 56 Hardy, 66 Thick-Skinned, and 43 Elemental Defender. I focus quite a lot on physical resistance, even though damage in PvE is leaning more towards magical damage types. That is because being a Breton Templar already gives me a lot of spell resistance, so if you aren't a Breton, you should probably put 20 to 30 more points from Hardy into Spell Shield. In the blue CP, I have 24 Spell Erosion, 56 Elemental Expert, 66 Elfborn, 66 Master at Arms, 21 Staff Expert, and 37 Thaumaturge. Blast is completely unnecessary and would be a damage loss, so I'm going with an allocation that gives me the best DPS in the average dungeon fight. The green CP come down to personal preference a lot. 76 Arcanist should be obvious though. Additionally, I'm using heavy attacks a lot as a sustain tool, as the more Magicka intense fights often have phases that allow me to heavy attack, so I have 64 points into tenacity. The rest is 40 Warlord, 19 Bashing Focus, 23 Shadow Ward, and 48 Tumbling. I tend to dodge a lot instead of blocking, so this is why I arranged my CP like that, but as I just said, it comes entirely down to personal preference. Next, we will go over the skills and passives. As you will see, Templar has a lot of synergy and multifunctionality in its kit, which allows for a lot of streamlining while still keeping the build extremely versatile. That's what sets Templar above any other class for me when it comes to hybrid role builds like this one. Anyways, my main spammable is Puncturing Sweeps for both single target and AoE, which works particularly well because the very strong self-heal allows me to pretty much ignore incoming damage. As an execute, I use Radiant Oppression, a amazingly strong skill that additionally has a lot of range, which is great for picking out low health targets in chaotic situations. On my front bar, I run 3 dots, Unstable Wall for the Maelstrom Staff effect, Blazing Spear, which can also function as a range spammable, and Mythic Orb for the very important synergy. On my back bar, I have another 2 dots, Solar Barrage for the Empower and Dawn's Wrath passives, and Ritual of Retribution for the Restoring Light passives and the Cleanse. Ritual is also the first one of my HOTS, the second one being Illustrious Healing. My primary healing skill is however Combat Prayer. And the last skill in my setup is Radiant Aura for the Minor Magicka Steel. There are also a few alternative or situational skills that you should be aware of. Radiating Regeneration can replace Illustrious Healing, and you need to use it instead if you're playing with the Maelstrom Restoration stuff. Elemental Drain and Siphon Spirit can both be replacements for Radiant Aura, depending on the additional effects you need. Channeled Acceleration and Channeled Focus can both be situational skills for either more damage or survival. And lastly, Force Pulse can be an alternative to puncturing sweeps if you prefer a ranged spammable. Moving on to ultimates, what I use almost always is Elemental Rage front bar and Crescent Sweep back bar. This gives me a lot of burst potential to open with and a cheap but strong burst ultimate for sustained damage. For ideal DPS in longer fights, you would want Meteor and Crescent Sweep, but for me Elemental Rage works better in actual dungeons. If your group has strong damage dealers but no tank with Warhorn, you can also use Warhorn instead to give your group the best possible damage. As passives, you want to have all the class trees, everything from restoration stuff, destruction stuff, and light armor. All passives that do not require 5 pieces for medium and heavy, Banish the Wicked from Fighter's Guild. If you play with Meteor, Everlasting Magic, and Magicka Controller from Mage's Guild, both Undaunted passives, all Rachel passives, and from Crafting, Medicinal Use from Alchemy, as well as Gourmand and Connoisseur from Provisioning. In terms of DPS dispatch, I'm consistently getting over 55k on the 21 million dummy, which I'm very happy with as I always set myself at least half the damage of ADD as my goal for builds like this one. For the dummy testing, I play with Ghastly Eyeball, as the sustain on the dummy is a lot weaker than in actual fights due to the fight length, no damage stops, and sustain tools not properly working on the dummy. Also keep in mind that being a healer means that your DPS in real fights can vary a lot, but 20% of the group damage is usually pretty reasonable. While a static rotation is possible on the dummy and performs pretty similar to a flexible one, I will only talk about the flexible rotation now, as it is a lot more practical than actual fights where you have to play reactive and use healing. For my rotation, I'm usually recasting my 4 10-second dots in a fixed rotation, while using Ritual of Retribution more reactively for its cleanse and the healing. However, I am still trying to keep it up, since it is also a strong dot. Combat Prayer is another skill I always want to keep up, but don't include in the partial rotation as it would lose me uptime and I often overcast it anyway for the burst heal. Radiant Aura I simply recast whenever it runs out, however this skill is a bit more situational as you can leave it out if fights are so short that the sustain doesn't matter anyway. The rest is just spamming puncturing sweeps until the dots or a buff needs to be recast. From 30% down, I then use Radiant Oppression instead of my regular spammable, while still keeping up my dots and buffs. Ideally, I'm keeping everything up unless it wouldn't run its full duration anymore, however it can be situationally better to not do that, for example when you cannot get into melee range or the target moves a lot. I always try to recast the front bar before the back bar, so I can use sweeps or oppression while still having the Berserker enchant active. Of course, I'm also trying to always weave, making a light attack before every skill, as light attacks are one of the biggest damage sources. If I have a big ultimate available, I open with it and then use Crescent Sweep whenever available, trying to proc Berserker right before using it. Illustrious Healing I only use when I expect high incoming damage, and if I play with the Maelstrom Restoration stuff, I always keep up Radiating Regeneration for the Magicka return. You basically want to keep up this rotation no matter what. Of course, in really bad situations, you will need to actively heal a lot, but still try to keep up as much as possible. You want to keep up the pressure to not let enemies and mechanics pile up, and you want to keep up the support so you don't run dry and your group can continue doing their job as well, because your best defense is a good offense. I think the most crucial aspect to succeeding when putting this build into practice is properly utilizing Combat Prayer. Situational awareness, good positioning, and reaction are important when healing with only Combat Prayer, as it is not necessarily easy to heal without easy to use smart target heals. However, it is entirely possible to do so, and in my opinion an important step into becoming more effective as a healer. In order to achieve that, you always want to think about how you can hit Combat Prayer when choosing your position, which means you usually want to either stand behind the entire group or at the side of the target, so your group is not split up around you. You should also always try to move with your damage dealers to avoid getting separated by mechanics. You always want to keep up Major Courage with Spell Cure that's done very easily by just keeping up your HOTS on the damage dealers. Olorim is a bit more complicated, as you need to control the proc to use it properly. It's not all that hard though, as with the stat only on your back bar, you don't proc it accidentally, and can use Illustrious Healing to place it wherever you want. With both Major Courage and Combat Prayer, you will find that DDs sometimes make it very hard for you to support them. In those cases, it's usually not worth to bother with if they don't listen, and you're better off just focusing on your own damage really. A lot of the difficulty with this build comes down to decision making in complex situations. Do I heal or support, or do I do damage instead? But having that choice is also what makes this build so great in my opinion, because you have the option to approach situations however you see fitting. And it can often be beneficial to let the healer kill an ad, for example, while the DDs burn down the boss. But sometimes it can also be better to just ignore mechanics if you have the healing power to just take the additional damage. Well, that was all I have for you today, and I hope you will have fun and success playing my build. And thanks for watching.